Okay, welcome again to Wissenschaft und Demokratie, Science and Democracy. This is the lecture for the 11th module. The 11th module is announced as being about science and the lay people, so the general public. And I'd like to say that this week's lecture is in one way a little different from several or many of the ones that we've had so far, where I kept fairly close to the readings. This week, I'm going to draw on a number of different readings, and actually on a lot on a reading that wasn't one of the main readings, because I realized that those are maybe interesting, maybe more interesting than the readings I had originally assigned, which were from Elizabeth Anderson. So I'm going to draw on some texts by Philip Kitcher as well, who talks about the relationship of the general public and science in a democratic society. So that's what I will focus on, the role of science in a democratic society, which of course is, in a sense, behind this whole course. And so this lecture will tie together a number of different strands that came up in different parts of the course. So that's arguably one thing that makes this lecture very particularly interesting, I hope, for at least some of you. Okay, so previously in this course, to go back, we've looked at the question, what's the importance of knowledge and evidence? We looked at this from a number of different angles. This Clifford James debate, what Lakatos and Kitcher had to say about what distinguishes science from pseudoscience, or what the strengths of the scientific method is according to Strevens. So then we went deeper into the question, well, what exactly is it that distinguishes science, especially the natural sciences, from other things, like philosophy, like religion, or like pseudoscience? That's what we encountered in Lakatos and Strevens. Then we completely changed kind of course and looked now away from science, but to the society. We asked the question, what's the point of having a government or a state at all? And we here looked at this social contract tradition that argued that the point of having a government is to solve problems of coordination, where without a government, without any state, we might not get what's best for us. So we need the state to get us to get what is actually in our interests. We looked at this also from the tragedy of the commons kind of perspective. And then we looked at this particular form of government that we have in Norway and other countries in Europe, namely a democracy. What is good about having a democracy? And one of the issues that we discussed here is that some people think that democracy gets us, for example, to be more happy, or it can serve other instrumental values. But we looked at that arguably democracy is good because it realizes a non-instrumental, something that's worthwhile, it's important in itself, freedom and equality. And these can be realized only in a democracy. Relatedly, we had the idea that we asked, well, what justifies the authority of the state? What justifies that the state has power over individuals? We looked at maybe democracy is the one form of government that can give a state legitimacy because the power is endowed by the people. Then we started to connect these questions about science and about democracy by looking at the social character of much knowledge, how the knowledge often depends on others. And then we ask questions about that. How can we gain knowledge from experts? How do we know who the experts are if we ourselves don't know anything about it? And how some people in some conditions might be excluded from that exchange of knowledge through epistemic injustice. Okay. So this module connects all of these issues. So that's partly it. I hope that's why I wanted to remind you of these issues, because we're going to connect these issues in various ways. Okay. So what I'll look at is something that Kitcher discusses in his article that I sort of assigned last minute, and he wrote also discusses in a book that he has. And that's, I want to start with this idea. Okay. Really, any kind of community of people will need a system for storing knowledge and for gaining new knowledge about the world, exchanging the knowledge between them, and then using that knowledge in practice. And I have deliberately here very different societies. So I had some Stone Age societies. Even that society, maybe it didn't have anything like a government. It too required the exchange of knowledge and information between the people. One person knows about plants, some specific plant. The other person doesn't know about it. How does that get to that? So the person, for example, doesn't get poisoned. And then we get more complex societies, like, say, on the lower left here, say, an ancient Roman or Babylonian society. A Babylonian society, they will get more complex forms of information. So maybe start writing down certain rules about how to construct houses and so on. And this helps to illustrate that this example helps to illustrate that this will be important. In order to get more complex forms of society, we'll need to store more information, more information, and we need systems for getting that from one person to the other. We need systems of writing, arguably evolved in order for sharing information in efficient ways. And then we get to ancient Greek societies, and we get to the modern democracies like Norway. But we also, of course, have systems for exchanging information also in, more totalitarian states like the Chinese or the USSR. They too had stores of information, that need to be shared with the people. So there's going to be a public inquiry and information system as Kitcher. Some system that stores information that's accessible to the public and it's used in various ways. Okay, that need not be itself democratically organized in a way. Now, when we have such a system, public inquiry and information system, we can ask various questions about it. So what should go into that store of information that the public broadly has access to? In some cases, say a farmer might know about some specific things, but there's a public store of information, maybe that specific knowledge about, say, what plants grow in a particular field, that need not be in the public store of information. Maybe that's fine if that particular person knows about it. But maybe there are some things that should be stored in ways that the whole society has access to the information in some way. So what topics are worth investigating is the first question. The second question is, who should be the person or who should be the people who contribute to that store of information the public uses to make its decision and so on? So who should be the one who contributes, and what do they contribute? Then another issue is transfer. Now, some things have been investigated by some people. How is that knowledge that now sort of these people have, how is that going to be then transferred to the rest of society? So this is a public store of information. Point of having that is that the public makes use of it in its decision making, be that in a monarchy, an authoritarian state, or a democracy. How is it best to transfer this knowledge to the public, or to whoever is the decision maker, whoever puts these decisions into practice? So the transfer question. And then there's also a certification question. Sometimes what's in the store might not be correct. How do we check whether this is really the information that we want to be there. How do we certify it somehow that it has a mark saying, yeah, that is good information and we want to keep it. Maybe other things should be thrown out. So we need somehow, for that to function as an inquiry in information systems, it needs to answer these questions. What should be in it? Who should contribute it? How should it be certified or checked? And how should it then be used for decision making? Okay. Now, issue to point out is that science is one important part of that public inquiry and information system. Now, I want to emphasize that this need not be a claim about science at all times. Maybe when the first scientists, like Galileo, did science, they didn't do it for the general public. They just did it for themselves. But today, science does serve as a system for getting us information about things that are of use to the public. That is a big portion of science and why we want to have an institution like science in the first place. Just think about the information about the spread of vaccines, the coronavirus in particular. Think about information about climate change. Think about also information, of course, about philosophy or about astrophysics. These are things that are important for the public, that function as an information that's available to the public. That's why science has scientific things are published in libraries that the public has access to. Now, we've already talked a little bit about how in the case of science, this knowledge that scientists have, that scientific experts has, now gets transferred to the public. This is the question: how does the public, given that they are not experts, how can they distinguish between who's an expert and who might be not an expert, who is a better expert than another expert? So we talked about that aspect of this question. We also talked a little bit about the question, who should contribute? And we talked about the issue of epistemic injustice, that some people, for example, might suffer from hermeneutic injustice. So their experiences, the society hasn't devised words or tools to put those experiences into a form so that they can enter into that public stored information that we call science, that excludes some people from it. Some other people might be excluded because they are not listened to. They suffer from testimonial injustice. So epistemic injustice can appear at this point that some people's knowledge were never able to enter into that public system of knowledge. Now, today we'll look more at these other questions. What are the topics that are worth investigating? How should they be certified? And also a little more at this question of transfer. And we look at it through the issue of science democracy. Okay. Now, so let's return to this question of the relationship between the scientists and the people. So we started this whole course with this idea that I'm calling in this slide the Platonic conflict idea. That there is a deep conflict between on one hand, the idea that the experts rule, the scientists who know about things, they find it Hobbes as well, that they're Leviathan, devises what's best for the people, and then makes a decision on that basis. Versus the rule of the people, that the people are really involved, democracy, everyone has a say, but arguably the people don't know very much about many things, so there's a conflict. So that's one picture, image for thinking about science and democracy, this idea what I call here Platonic conflict between expert rule versus people's rule. A different way of looking at science and democracy is that science really has nothing to do with society at all, and that I'm calling the gentleman's model. This is the gentleman's club is like a club that some people have access to. They just, in a certain sense, just hang out. Yes, it's a special sort of occasion for highly privileged white males, but they are really just, that's what science is. It's about people who have that special interests, and it has nothing to do with the people at large. But maybe there's a different way of thinking about it. I'm going to call this picture of science and democracy as the harmonic integration model. Maybe there is a way of weaving science into democracy, into public decision making, so that science is used for the people, and it doesn't creates no conflict between the people, but it doesn't stand outside the society. It's weaved into the society in a way that enhances decision making by democratic societies. The question is this possible? And should science work like that? Or is the gentleman's model completely fine? So now, to answer this question, let's remind ourselves of why democracy was a good thing. What are the arguments for democracy? We've heard that on the one hand, there's instrumental justifications for democracy, where democracy functions as a means to an end. One idea, for example, here was an epistemic justification for democracy. By involving many people in decision making, maybe we could get to know more than we would if we involved only a few. Maybe Plato was just wrong that some people have insight into the heaven of Platonic ideas, the philosophers, while other people don't. Maybe by involving many people, we'll actually get to know more. Another issue that if the goal is to do something that's in the good for everyone, then maybe unlike Hobbes and this Leviathan, we need to actually ask people what they want. And one way to ask them is to get them to vote. We talked about problems with this idea, but it's still an idea that in some way you need to involve people in decision making in order to come to know what is actually good for them. But there's another set of justification for democracy, and that's this idea of intrinsic justification for democracy. Maybe we don't want a democratic society because we want to achieve certain aims. Maybe we want a democratic society because there's something good about that in itself. And here the central idea is that arguably democracy is the form of government that's uniquely suited to realize certain values, which values the values of freedom and equality. It's in a democratic society where individuals are free to express their views on who should rule and which policies and laws are adopted. They can express those, they have a say in them, and they're treated equally by having equal say on what matters are important to them. So democratic societies are ones that realize values of freedom. Individuals are free to shape their own lives, positive freedom. They're free also from oppression, negative freedom, and they're all equal in that regard. And because in democratic societies, everyone can arguably realize their freedom without oppressing others, arguably that is the only form of government that has political legitimacy. Because here there's no as Rousseau points out, it's not like one person's really ruling over another. It's rather that everyone is involved in that self-rule. Now, this, as we also talked about, this idea of thinking about democracy entails that elections are not really what democracy is all about. They're neither necessary nor sufficient for a proper democracy. They're not necessary because, for example, you can also have this lotocracy alternative where you just select random people. That still draws on the will of the people, especially if these people are constrained in their decision makings by certain rules that have been put in place. But doesn't work in elections. It arguably is also not sufficient, and we'll talk about why it might not be sufficient, because elections might not be enough to involve people in decision making. So democratic societies, like all societies, need a well-functioning inquiry and information system. Okay, we need a system for having knowledge and distributing that knowledge among everyone. How do we realize the common good? We are interested in democratic society, in something that we all want. How do we get what we want? We need a lot of information about that. We need a system to distribute that information amongst us. How do we live together so that everyone is free and equal? How can we actually do that? So, for example, we need a system to decide whether it's better to have a autocracy or the democracy with elections like we have it today. Well, how do we find out about such things? We need something like an inquiry system that investigates various different forms. And so we need, for realizing a complex society that can work as a democracy, we need knowledge information for that. As Hardwick and others who we read have pointed out, we can learn from others, and through the division of labor, optimize cognitive processes. We can learn more by drawing on others than we could ever by ourselves. We can draw on what previous generations and people in different circumstances have done by reading what they have written down. And science, arguably, is an essential part of this inquiry and information systems that societies have developed to live together in a better way. So now comes an argument that I would like to present to you and I'd like you to think about. Why science needs to be democratic. At least science as we have it today, and for the most part. Maybe there are some parts of science that need not be democratic. Okay, so here is an argument. I'm going to present this as an argument. The first premise of the argument, the first assumption, is that democracy is the form of government that uniquely realizes the values freedom and equality. I've talked about that already. Democracy arguably is the kind of government that is legitimate because it is uniquely suited to realize everyone's freedom in an equal way. But then, second premise, freedom and equality can be realized in society only if the people are involved in those matters that centrally shape their lives. You're not free to live, so that you don't have positive freedom to live, to shape the life according to your own values if you don't know about what is important. If there's something that has a deep influence on you and you're not involved in that, then you're to that degree less free. But the inquiry and information system in our societies deeply shape or centrally shape the lives of the people. What knowledge we have about climate change, what change will affect us. What knowledge we have of the brain will affect us. What knowledge we have about engineering will affect us. Which tools are we going to use in the future? Are we going to ban smartphones, use something else? Are we going to fly to Mars? Are we going to, so many things are going to centrally affect us. Things that are in this public store of information and exchange of information. And science, as I said, is clearly a central part of this public inquiry and information systems that we have. But then it seems like freedom and equality can be realized in society only if people are involved in science, because otherwise their lives are centrally shaped by something, science, in which they have no say in that. To that degree, they're not free. But that seems to show that democracy, real democracy, is possible only if the people are involved in science. That's an argument that one finds to some degree in this Kitcher article that we've that I have assigned at the last minute a little bit in the readings that you're happy to read. You don't have to read it. This argument has some premises about democracy and about the role of science in society. And as a conclusion, it states that democracy is only possible if the people are involved in science. I think that is an interesting conclusion. That is not a conclusion I think that all scientists accept. Is not a conclusion I think that everyone already accepts. So I think if it's true, it's an interesting conclusion. I'd like you to think about that. And in the next part of our lecture, I'm going to get to the question and that arises, of course, next. Okay, how though should people be involved in science? What does that actually mean? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next part of the lecture.